So nice to see you again. I'm always really appreciative when you come by to visit. So today, although I really wanted to have more of a spiritual vibe to my channel, I find I also need to explain that sometimes what I consider spirituality really filters into many aspects of how I look at the world and in life in general. So it's not just a matter of practicing any one particular religion. Sometimes I borrow from many, and that kind of ties into what I want to talk to you about today. And it's the issue of cultural appropriation. And I don't know that I have any definitive final answers. I think I've come to terms with some opinions. But in doing so, I have really done a lot of thinking when I hear about how other people talk about cultural appropriation and how it's being defined and how it's being used and how we as a people are supposed to be responding to that. And I don't think I really agree with a lot of things that are being talked about with regard to cultural appropriation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the development of thought that I've had over quite some time now, months and months and months of looking at different videos, and just given my own level of maturity, given my own journey through life, and it's basically food for thought. So although in listening to this you may or may not agree with everything, if you do choose to respond, please do so in a very respectful way. I really want this channel to be a venue for discussion, for intelligent, respectful discussion. And we do not have to agree on everything just to, make nice, to get along. But if you're going to explain how you differ in opinion, then do so in a respectful way. So far on my channel, I've had really, really wonderful comments. So far I've been pretty lucky with the people who've been attracted to the channel. So let's go into it. For one thing, we talk about cultural appropriation as being cultural appropriation is basically when, as I understand it, and I disagree with some of these definitions, so therein lies the issue. So what it's being described as when a dominant culture in power take items or products, ideologies, religious or spiritual practices from another culture, and then once they take that, they then market it for profit, for either social recognition or for profit. Also tied into that is not just like the mass production of these sort of ideas or practices or material goods, but also the purchase of. So you, the average person, myself included, the average person, when we buy items X, Y, and Z that are traditionally from culture X, Y, and Z, that somehow there's something wrong with me wearing it or you wearing it if you are not from that culture, because you are then appropriating it, in my opinion. What I want to talk about is all of these shades of gray, because something that would be that blatantly disrespectful towards a particular culture, and then the thing is that we have to ask ourselves, why do we see that as disrespectful? So that's where I see the shades of gray, and really look at why we find that is disrespectful. Maybe it's because this guy is walking around like a peacock. Maybe it's because it's not his own culture. Maybe it's because it's not being worn in a ceremonial, in context appropriately. Yes, 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 and yes for that situation. Let's look at some other situations and just look at the arguments that I have here. When we look at items like a sombrero, like a shamrock, like a heart for Valentine's Day, which also has a history connected to a culture. When we look at items like the dream catcher, when we look at items such as a sari, which is connected to a culture, Hawaiian grass skirt, these are all things that are tied to a given culture, a given practice, either in spirituality or religion. There's just a whole lot of them, these symbols, these things that we wear that have come from a given culture. Do we as a people, inclusive, so when we meet people who are from a different culture, it's important to be inclusive and to include them into our circle. And it would seem, I guess, at this point, that as long as I include people like this in my workspace, in my school group, like in my, if you're a student in your friends circle, that it's almost okay just to stop there. But let me give you an experience, for instance. I grew up with one of my lifelong friends. I love her to pieces, and her family, and she's East Indian, and I am not. And way before it was cool to eat East Indian food, I was into it because her mom would cook for us, and I loved it. So I would go over to her place, especially would love it when they would, and made it very clear that I loved being invited for supper. So today it's a lot more popular, and I love going to East Indian, all-you-can-eat buffets. But we see people who are in that restaurant who are of the culture and who are making authentic food, so it's okay if they make money selling things of their own culture. If a person who is not East Indian were to open a restaurant and make money on things of their culture, like, for instance, a chef. Let's just say a chef goes to a chef school and learns how to make things, culinary delights from all sorts of things from around the world. And he or she opens up a restaurant and cooks XYZ from around the world. Is that cultural appropriation if he's cooking things from elsewhere? So I leave that as one question to you, but the line of thinking these are the things that I mull over in my mind. I think, where do I fit in? I am a genetic mix of eons of different marriages. Should I even be using the word marriage? Because does anybody ever really get married anymore? Or stay married, indeed. But so let's just call it, genetically, I'm the product of many, many, many people historically. And we are all not of just one culture. We may want to practice one culture. If your mother is from one culture, your father is from a different culture and or religion and or, all of that kind of falls into the argument of cultural appropriation. And then they each have two parents, and where do they come from? In the past couple of generations, there's been a lot more interracial and marriages, and we are being a lot more relaxed about what defines you as a person and where you can choose to marry. So do any of us really only have to restrict ourselves to one culture based on birthright? That's one thing that I struggle with. If I want to wear a sombrero purely because I want to wear a sombrero and I walk with that down the street or on the beach, because I visited a place that sold them, and I bought it from somebody who was an artisan from that country. And I bring that back home and I wear it on the beach or I wear it somewhere. Is that cultural appropriation? And if that's the case, then would I or you be encouraged to buy things from artisans? Would we be encouraged to go to a fair and buy something, pierogies from people who have made it because it's of their culture? Okay. But once it's something that you can wear or you can wear with pride. If it's not of your own culture, then do you really have any business wearing it or not? And that seems to be where I have trouble with the whole issue of cultural appropriation. Now, I don't think I would be wearing a sombrero anywhere. So what if I like something so much, something that originates from a different culture, and I like it so much that I study it, and I study it so much that I become a practitioner, and through that skill, I start earning a living. So I mean stuff like yoga has been discussed with regard to cultural appropriation. A lot of people who are practicing yoga find the benefits of yoga because they transcend culture. But we still appropriate it, we still take it, and we still make money if you are teaching yoga. So if you are not from that culture that created yoga, then do you have any business making money from practicing it? That is an argument that's been brought forth by cultural appropriation, all the people who are talking about cultural appropriation. And I take issue with that because it's really exclusive. It seems to be a way, when we talk about cultural appropriation, it seems to be a way that we are segregating people and making it appropriate, because the big words, cultural appropriation, well, them's big school words, it must be, really, I don't think that practicing something and making a living out of it has to do with robbing a culture of what was theirs. It may be an issue of plagiarism. So when you're teaching a yoga class, perhaps you'd be best to sort of give the history of yoga, where it came from, and then go on with teaching your class or your course, so that your students know the history of it. We are all not Japanese, and yet karate has benefited many people on the planet. And is that an example of cultural appropriation? Well, I would argue that it is, just in the same way as yoga is, and that it is okay. I would say it's okay. I'll give you a few more examples. Some people will practice voodoo and Reiki and Wicca and are clearly not of those, cultural descent. The Africans who came because of slave trade. And from there, we see voodoo and hoodoo. And those practices are steeped with so much history. And even in there's an intermix of Catholicism and sainthood. And there's just such an intermix of so many things. Basically, historically, it was to cover up what they were practicing. But still, the people today who are practicing voodoo may not be of that cultural descent, and yet they're still practicing it. So that is also cultural appropriation. And we see it as okay because you are following your truth spiritually and you are exploring your own path. Same thing with Wicca. How many of us have come from a European descent directly from, the whole witchcraft stories and Gerald Gardner, but we separate the differences between Wicca and witch and make our own arguments for following things that appropriate from those cultures. And we think it's okay. And I would argue that it is. And I'll tell you why a little bit later. These are just examples that I've been struggling with. These are examples that I've been struggling with over time because we seem to point the finger when we want to make arguments for, downtrodden mass production of product, when we want to find fault in making money because of selling product, when we want to point the finger at the white person for being in a place of privilege and appropriating from cultures that are less privileged. I'm white, And I have a mix of all sorts of stuff, but I'm still seen as white. I just don't know that it's really helpful to be pointing the finger at people. And does that mean that the only people who can engage in cultural appropriation are white? What if somebody of culture X takes from culture Z and does the same thing as a white person would? But because you can't really tell the difference between that skin tone of brown and that skin tone of brown, you don't even point the finger or fault them. It's seen as, celebrating each other. But if a person from a middle upper class who happens to have a skin tone of white that is doing the very same thing, then we can point the finger and blame them for a cultural appropriation. And I think that that's sort of like a reverse discrimination. Now, that might not be a very popular argument, but I think in having an intelligent conversation about anything, and in this case, cultural appropriation, you have to be able to look at all sides of an argument to be able to come to some sort of reasonable conclusion. I don't know that this will ever be concluded. But we have to find what makes sense for us as a process in our experience as humans. I'd like to look at more of what makes us similar and how we can celebrate what's similar and what's different with us and embrace each other for our cultural differences. And am I destined, that's another thing I thought about, is am I destined to only, me personally, but you personally, are we all sort of destined to only be able to purchase, pardon me, we all destined to just be able to purchase things from our birthright, from our culture, and wear them proudly? What if, for whatever reasons, you've decided or you've learned to not wear things from that culture in which you were born, but you really associate very much with another culture, or perhaps like in witchcraft and in Wicca, well, more so in witchcraft, there tends to be a real eclecticism. In fact, we can even some people even call themselves eclectic witches, where we borrow from all senses of spirituality. Now, that is something that that would be an example of cultural appropriation. However, I think it makes us stronger. Us as a people on the planet, not just witches. I think it makes us stronger as people when we can see the wisdom of other cultures and embrace it and practice it. So the ideas of Buddha or Mother Teresa or Gandhi or, all of the people who have walked before us and who've spoken their truth, whatever culture they're from, whether it's Maya Angelou or Gerald Gardner, they all come from their own culture. But if we borrow from all of their different ideas, then we, as a people on the planet walking in this day and age, we're stronger because we take the strengths of the people who have walked before us. And yes, that is cultural appropriation. And I think it's okay to have a Buddha on your altar or your prayer space at home. I think it's okay to have prayer water on your altar at home. I was brought up with a Catholic upbringing. And do you know that is some pagan shit? That is pagan. And yet, when you come in, you dab your finger in there and you do the sign of the cross with holy water. You sprinkle, there's what we call asperge, they spray holy water at different times of the year. That's pagan. That's pagan practice. So we look at Christianity and there's been a real marriage, cultural appropriation, religious appropriation. You've taken from the pagans and you've taken from the Christians, and you've taken and you make yourself a stronger group. Historically, there was a reason for that. They wanted to be stronger in numbers and so on and so forth. I'm not discussing that here, but I'm just saying solely that is the topic of cultural appropriation. We've done it as a people on this planet for millennia. We have, and it has been okay. It brings us together. I think part of the mystique that attracts people to practices such as yoga and Reiki or shamanism is the fact that it comes from a different culture. There's something, I think it's a mystique in those cases. Yoga, Reiki, and shamanism. Yeah, they to me represent the wisdom of people who have walked before us. All three of those come from very different cultures, different parts of the planet, and different periods in history. But we today, it's not difficult today to find somebody who is practicing yoga, Reiki, and shamanism on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. And they will call themselves a spiritual person. But that is completely an example of cultural appropriation. And I think it's okay. It has to be okay. It has to be okay. Otherwise, we would be so isolated. We would be restricted to live within such confines and to never live with the wisdom of the people who have walked before us. And that would be a shame. That there are really no new ideas. It has been argued that there are no new ideas. We just keep recycling old ideas and reshape them and morph them into new ideas. One of the ways that we do this, if you look at the fashion industry, they're constantly taking, we have to cover different body parts. Our arms are of a certain shape. Our legs are a certain shape. And so, yes, you could do all kinds of creative things. But at the end of the day, if you want to sell it to people who need to move and work and cook and do their jobs, you need to make things that are functional. So they're within certain limitations. So what they do is they take different ideas from different cultures, from different wherever in history and across space and time, and they reformulate it, and they have to come up with something inventive and practical every season. That has within it its own limitations. But what they do is they have been faulted for cultural appropriation, for taking ideas and presenting them on the runway. One example was that parka, that black and white parka with I think it was a bear print and it was basically an Inuit sort of with the hand prints. It was an Inuit, I believe, design that was marketed. I've seen somewhere on the internet as that being an example of cultural appropriation. I think in that way, the problem there is that they didn't ask permission, as far as I can see. It's plagiaristic. When you take something and you call it your own, and it was not your own design, then I see that as an issue of plagiarism. So that's one of the arguments where I see as we need to tease apart the broad term of cultural appropriation and look at what it is under that umbrella term that we are really opposed to. Is it the mass production? Is it the making money? Is it isolating and excluding one culture from another? This is our culture, that's yours, you stay on your side of the fence and you stay on your side of the fence. That becomes problematic because, as I was talking about intermarriage and so on, and also embracing spiritually, your neighbor and being of the same circles, you're going to share cultural similarities and differences. So I see that as a problem underneath that umbrella term when it's a matter of segregation. So is it the segregation or the need of segregation under the term of cultural appropriation? So let's see, plagiarism, mass production, segregation. Yeah, I think that the term cultural appropriation is so broad that it's becoming silly and a little overused, and it's a way of blaming other people when it's convenient to do so. I don't see it as very practical, because historically people have really borrowed from each other's cultures, always. So with regard to the thought of the dream catcher, let's just say that I'm living in a world where cultural appropriation is as it is, and I don't want to buy a dream catcher from somebody, because if I put a dream catcher up, I'm afraid of being accused because it wasn't purchased from, or maybe it was purchased from somebody who is Indigenous and it is of their culture. So I'm putting it up in my window, and it's to function as such. And I'm using the example of a dream catcher, but bear in mind that this could be the parka, this could be the tartan, this can be the sari, this can be any item. I'm just talking about insert item here. Okay, so dream catchers up in my window. So that I'm not going to be accused of plagiarism or cultural appropriation, I am going to take a ball of yarn, sparkly yarn, mash it all up in knots and hang it in my window and call it a thought trap. Okay, it's a brand new idea, so I can't possibly be appropriating that from a culture, even though the story behind my thought trap could be similar, but no one can point the finger at me. Now, that's why I think sometimes plagiarism becomes part of the argument of cultural appropriation, because as long as you are citing your source, there should be no problem. So these are some of the thoughts that plague me when I think about defining cultural appropriation, and I feel the need to define it so that I can be respectful within its confines. But I'm really struggling with being able to define it. For instance, the term witch. I have often struggled with, am I a witch or am I not a witch? If I wear the term witch, can I do as the women who have said it's okay, because if you are a woman and you practice this, that, and the other thing with herbs and spirituality, and if you consider this, that, and if you have these beliefs and you follow this way and you're exploring your spirituality, then you are a witch. Find your power as a woman. Okay, in those contexts, there's a lot of ways where I will call myself a witch. However, the term witch is so fraught with history that is it a matter of cultural appropriation? Because I've really never lived in the UK. I've never lived anywhere in the States, not anywhere close to Salem, not anywhere close to Gardner, not anywhere close to... So I really struggle with these terms, because to me it tends to be borrowing from a different culture, and I want to be okay with it, because as we move forward as a people on the planet at this point in time, we are morphing into new ideas. We do appropriate from one another, and in doing so, I would think that when we take all the differences from different cultures and we move forward, we not only become stronger, but we find more of what makes us similar. I mean, think about it. People, before the age of communication and technology, people lived on different parts of the planet, and they could not communicate with each other unless they actually took a boat and physically went to that other part of the planet. So communication was quite, restricted. Yet, throughout history and on different parts of the planet, we all have some sense of spirituality. We all have a God idea, a spirit idea. So although one culture's, conviction of what is spiritual and another culture's conviction of what is spiritual may be vastly different, the fact is that we are similar in that we look at a higher being or a higher power as something that we can communicate, at least with thought, if not anything else. We are spirit who are only temporarily wearing our culture and our body for the time that we're on this planet, for this particular lifetime, until our energy transforms and becomes something else. From a scientific standpoint, that makes sense. We are energy. We are made of energy. That energy is what we call spirit. And what makes our culture is really only temporary. So yeah, from a scientific standpoint, what I was saying is energy, we know that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It is only transferred. So before your conception, what were you? You were energy. You were still there. You were just under a different form. After you die, where does your spirit go? Where does your energy go? It's going to go somewhere. So this is only a temporary vehicle that we have. And I think it would be really, really sad to fault you and you and you for culturally appropriating, when really we're on this journey to learn from each other, to borrow from each other. We are to accept each other. And I think if I eat of your food and if I wear of your clothes, then I'm much more likely to want to invite you into my home than if I create fences and reasons for us to stay different. That's why I don't agree with cultural appropriation. The whole argument, let's be clear. Cultural appropriation, I don't think that is bad. Plagiarism is not right. So if you're taking from a different culture and you're not giving them credit, then that's not right. There are aspects underneath the umbrella term of cultural appropriation that I think need to be defined. But the fact that we do acknowledge each other and we embrace each other's differences culturally, that's got to be okay. And that's got to stay okay. We can't be blamed for loving each other that way. There's the idea that, and this is part of my professional training, that we must be inclusive. Inclusivity is something that we're learning more about in recent years. And that term means that when there are people who are from cultures other than your own, that you welcome them into your group, into your work group, into your school group, and so on. That is right to do. We're differently abled, we are of different sexual orientations, and it doesn't matter if your soul has to recognize another person's soul. That's how I see being inclusive. However, when I hear the arguments for cultural appropriation, to me, it really kind of puts a barrier there between me and people of a different culture. And to tell you the truth, I'm not even sure I even have much of a culture. I am French Canadian, and based on the history of my country and the coloring of my hair and features, I likely have some native descent. Beyond that, coming from something French in Europe? I'm not sure. Somewhere around the 1600s. That's as far as my father was able to trace. So does that mean that I'm really only ever going to be able to choose from those things? And what if I wasn't brought up to be native? Does that mean that I can embrace it? These Native American practices? Does that mean that I can't because I wasn't? I'll tell you, I've met some really wonderful Native people. They are like, come on in. If you have one drop, the elder that I talked to, she says, if you have one drop of Native blood, you are Native. So yeah, so that's the whole argument is about inclusivity and exclusivity. So you must be inclusive with other people, but not culturally appropriate from them. So you must exclude practicing, but you must embrace them. And so it seems to be this push-pull. And I don't buy the exclusion part of the argument with cultural appropriation. I just don't. I think we should be more inclusive. As much as is respectful, and to broaden the term of what is respectful, because these days it just seems like purchasing something that was made from a different culture, if it was not made from an artisan of that culture, then that's wrong. And I'm not so sure that every culture wants to be an artisan of their own products. Not everybody wants to be making dream catchers. Not everybody wants to be making, I don't know, Mexican clothes. And I go back and forth with these arguments because, for instance, if I say, okay, a pawn show with clearly Mexican patterns of fabric, if a company decides, that's what's going to be the fashion statement this year, so we'll get people from China to work under really terrible conditions and manufacture them inexpensively, and then we'll ship them to another country. Yeah, that's a problem, but it's not a problem only for cultural appropriation. That's a problem for a lot of reasons. That is bad working conditions. That is an oppressive society. That is mass production. That is people who are making money who continue to make money. And it's just all about oppression all the way around. But to just sort of isolate the issue of culture in that argument is kind of narrow-minded. So yeah, I really struggle with these things, and I do think about those things before I buy products. Yeah. And then I consider the fact that we all are descendants of the same place on the planet. The planet at one point didn't have different continents. It was all one great big piece. And then people migrated, and then there was movement of, tectonic plates and stuff, and then people continue to, migrate and so on. So we all come from the same sort of, what is it, Mesopotamia or something? That place around the north of Africa or so. We all come from a very similar place on the planet originally. And so therefore, are we really different one from another? Does that then entitle us to use absolutely any cultural products and wear them as our own? I don't know. Those are questions that I ask myself. So the idea that buying something that has been associated with a given culture and wearing it is somehow robbing that culture of something meaningful, for instance, of their identity. Like, let's just say I'm wearing a pair of earrings that have feathers and that are somehow reminiscent of, indigenous culture. Does that really rob them, or does it mean that I am honoring them because I bought it from somebody of that culture who actually made it? What if it's not made by somebody of that culture? What if it's made by someone else who thought it was pretty to make this beadwork or whatever? It gets a little fuzzy for me, because sometimes when I think about people in the music industry who make what they think is an original song, and yet parts of the song are reminiscent of melodies that have been written in songs in the past, and they're plagiarizing something from the past inadvertently, they can be found at fault. And we're talking about very simple riffs. We're not talking about, okay, you took the exact template of that song. We're talking about a melody. And the people have been taken to court for stuff like that because it's plagiaristic. Well, in the same vein, a lot of people do that with cultural items, because that's where you get into the idea that there are very few new ideas. I mean, a lot of things are just sort of recycled old ideas. I mean, how many different ways are there to make a pierogi, a cannoli, a ravioli, a dumpling. Every culture has some kind of dough-like thing that wraps around something else that you eat. A burrito, I don't know. There's some similar, there's similar things that are being made across cultures that I don't think you can really help but appropriate things from different cultures. And so it has to be okay. And we have to sort of look at what makes it respectful and what makes it not respectful. And I think the term is a little too broad right now. Let's take the argument of learning a new language. Now, we know that there's all sorts of good benefits from learning a new language. You are directly embracing a different culture. We see that a lot with K-pop right now, right? I mean, different cultures coming in and it's being made popular. So, children are learning Korean, and that introduces new neural pathways. The more languages you learn, the more connections there are made in your brain. And so it makes it easier to learn more concepts later on in life because of the pathways that are there. And you can then, make more dendrites and more collaterals later. The more of an enrichment that you have at a younger age or at all ever throughout your lifetime, the better it is for you. So there's all this wonderful, benefit to learning a different language. It fits the argument of cultural appropriation. If you were not born of that culture, then what are you doing speaking their language? Also, when you look at scientific discovery, is science devoid of culture? Is it on a frontier of its own and untouchable? Well, scientists come up with new ideas. Scientists can come up with inventions. Scientists can discover laws and ways that things work. Now, let's look at the inventions. Does that mean that if somebody from a given culture invents something, that no one else can use it without being guilted? If it fits the argument, the very vague argument of what is cultural appropriation today, the answer would be no. Thou shalt not. And that's why I think the argument is a little faulty. The argument that we are presenting today of cultural appropriation as if thou shalt not. That's why I think it's incorrect. So here, I'm just going to read this directly to be succinct. Here's a situation. Consider this. Just wear the shirt for a little bit. What if there is an adult child of an immigrant or of immigrant parents in a westernized culture? She takes ideas from both of her parents who have different cultures, and she invents a product that blends the best of both ideas. Then she markets it out for profit to the world. Is this an example of cultural appropriation? And if it is, then is it a bad thing? Is she entitled to borrow ideas simply because she happened to be born from these two cultures? Is she entitled to sell this blend of ideas? Are people entitled to buy them and wear or display them, these products that she has created, even though they don't come from those cultures? So, she, the inventor, could not possibly produce thousands of this product, so there will be mass production if the demand is there. So are we opposed to the cultural appropriation? Are we opposed to mass production? Are we opposed to making money? What is it under these terms that we keep on arguing about? What is it that that really is the problem? The reason why I gave that as an argument, that's a segue to get into this. Now, this is something we can all relate to. Consider J.K. Rowling, the writer of the Harry Potter series, who blended ideas from the plentiful history of the world. She produced stories that incorporated ideas of culture, religion, myths from everywhere, practices from everywhere, all over the world, and with historical relevance. So, is J.K. Rowling guilty of cultural appropriation? According to the definition of cultural appropriation that is floating around and the way that we are arguing about it these days proudly on social media, she would be guilty of cultural appropriation. And I would say it's okay because she's not the first one. We've been doing it for millennia. She is now in a place of privilege. She wasn't when she first started writing those stories. So clearly she is now in a place of privilege, financially speaking, but it is clearly because of her work and skill in blending the intellectual property of cultures and religions and myth that has been pervasive throughout history. I think this is a good thing, and she is guilty of cultural appropriation, and cultural appropriation is a blaming term. I'm saying, you know what? I don't think there are many people who really only have one culture, one identity. We are a blend. Most people have a blend of a wealth of historical genetics. Is that a correct term? You know what I mean. So while I'm walking around the deep end, why don't we take a dive? Okay, let's stop dipping our toe into the argument and get into something that touches everybody. Let's talk about religion and spirituality. So if I talk about Christianity, and Christianity comes from very much a different culture altogether. If we're here in North America, South America, I mean, it was of Jerusalem. It was from a very small part of the world, Bethlehem. And it has grown. And in growing from one day to the next, over 2,000 years plus, it has morphed. It has touched many people. It has taken from many different belief systems and cultures, and in doing so has divided amongst itself to all the different Christian religions. And it is no longer what it was once, because Christianity itself, I think, is probably the greatest example of cultural appropriation, and yet we accept it, and we profit from it because we make careers out of it, and we make necklaces out of themes that are Christian, and books, etc. So if it's not okay in one context to appropriate culturally, then we need to examine why and how we're going to apply that argument across the board. Now, I don't know of any one person who will brag about coming from a culture that practices crucifixion. Yet, it was actually a very popular practice at one time as a means of law enforcement and oppression. And although, we don't do it as a practice today, the symbol of that culture, of that point in time, the crucifix, is marketed, mass-produced, and used. Even though it comes from one culture and it has a historical purpose, like historically crucifixion had a purpose, we have attributed meaning to it. New life, dying for our sins, whatever that is. There are reasons why the symbol of the crucifix has been marketed and is now so popular. And those meanings have morphed for various people over time. But still, the use of that crucifix is an example of cultural appropriation. and it's pervasive. It's much like putting a little guillotine on your necklace, or a hangman's loop on your necklace and wearing that. Why not wear one of those things as opposed to a crucifix? Symbolically, they're different only because of the meaning we put to it. But let's not forget that as we're arguing so much today about cultural appropriation, the buying and selling and use of the crucifix is, for all intents and purposes, it fits the argument of what is to appropriate something culturally. And it's how we use that. When somebody wears a crucifix, are they then oppressing people from Jerusalem? The thought never crosses your mind, not until you watch this video. So it's the meaning that we put to objects that I think is, that's what I'm zoning in on. It's the meaning that you put to an object that is the issue. That's kind of what I'm getting into, is I'm zoning in on what is the meaning that we put to objects or practices like yoga or Reiki or clothing that comes from a different country. It's the meaning that you put to it. That is something that is worth discussing. And I think it's not even going to be the same for every particular culture. Some cultures may be quite offended if you use their things, and some may be proud. So that's why I think that the topic of cultural appropriation is over-inclusive and should not apply to everyone. And there are so many individual differences, even within each culture. So I don't know that it's really appropriate to be talking about cultural appropriation. Then again, talking about what I know, which is Wicca or paganism, we do look at Sabbats and the practice of Sabbats. That can be seen as another example of cultural appropriation, perhaps. Certainly, Gerald Gardner took it upon himself to put it all back to back close together and make the Sabbats as part of the Wiccan practice. And there will be examples of that throughout history prior to Wicca, where pagans have observed the Sabbats. But what I'm getting at is that the Sabbats are not the same for everyone across the planet. Because if the Sabbats are a celebration of the changing of the seasons, not everybody all over the planet will experience a change of seasons in the same way. In Australia, the whole calendar is flipped kind of upside down because they're on another hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, we have a practice of Sabbats according to Gardnerian sort of, winter and spring and summer and fall, with the appropriate Sabbats and the quarter celebrations in between. But the seasons are not the same for everyone, because winter-like celebrations with Yule and are not the same for people around the equator. They basically have spring-like weather and summer-like weather all year round. So the transition of the seasons are not the same for them. So my argument there is, is it an appropriation of culture to be celebrating Sabbats unless you adapt it to your own environment? If you're adapting it to your own environment, are you then changing something from different cultures? And where does how do you ever, in the history of the planet, come to an agreement that there are 8 days to be marked around the world? That is something that I think is really a product of, it's a product of communication. Because people in Australia don't really know what people in England are doing prior to the telephone. and how seasons are celebrated. So how can we all have agreement about these 8 particular Sabbats? The observances were probably quite different over years. So the fact that we have come to an agreement about having 8 Sabbats and they all have the same name, and they're practiced in this way and they represent XYZ, that is a result of cultural appropriation, because there seems to be some sort of agreement that's been popularized across peoples all over the planet. And I find it really curious, because I think that that's a very recent thing and a product of sharing from each other what our ideas are. So, does that mean it's disrespectful to wear shamrocks, green hats, and drink green beer on St. Patrick's Day if you are not Irish? Does it mean you should stop celebrating Thanksgiving because you're not a direct descendant of pilgrims? Yeah, I think I can say that, because Mabon is not Thanksgiving. Mabon is a different thing altogether. So yeah, pilgrims. Okay. Anyway, it's a question. Let's just say many holidays reflect a practice that comes from one culture or another. So does celebrating them mean it's cultural appropriation? I would say, yeah, sure. And it's okay. I think there are some strong arguments for looking at all of the things that I've mentioned in this video as examples of cultural appropriation. We like to find reasons to celebrate, and that's okay. We celebrate our cultural heritages, whether it's if I wear a green hat and wear a shamrock on St. Patrick's Day, but some people who are not Catholic or Irish will definitely be drinking green beer in the middle of March. So that's cultural appropriation. According to our going definition, our working definition, that's cultural appropriation. But we see it as okay. The thing is that we shouldn't be trapped and restricted by our birthright. Let's consider that our identity and that of others is fluid. It changes over the course of your lifetime. You may identify with one spiritual belief at one point in your life and then certainly morph into another. Those spiritual beliefs will have roots in culture that are not of your own, and that is okay. When we talk about cultural appropriation, it seems to really pivot around the argument of material goods and intellectual property. Should any one person or any one culture, now should is a big word, but should any one person or any one culture really have such a sense of self tied into material goods or intellectual property? That I think there's room for discussion there. That I would like to hear. I would like to hear from you, no matter what it is you want to touch on here in this discussion, so long as it's presented in a respectful way. I think that discussing these things really, really is important in connecting us in our social awareness and our ability to really respect one another. And face it, we've all been blended from a multitude of different people who have walked before us. So instead of looking at segregating one from the other, instead of sort of isolating various cultural groups one from the other, maybe we can focus on how we treat each other and how we respect each other and how we embrace each other's cultures, and how we adopt, from one another. Maybe focus more on the behavior than on the purchases. So I guess in the end, I have more questions than statements. I certainly want to look at this as food for thought in a lot of ways. I'm inviting some intelligent conversation about this. I'm leaning more towards, I don't want to continue to use a word like cultural appropriation because the way that it's being used is a very blaming term. It is a term where if you're culturally appropriating something, it seems like you're doing something that is really, really bad. And disrespectful and uninformed and unintelligent. When really the whole practice of cultural appropriation is something that everybody has done over millennia to each other. I think different cultures can and should express pride in what has led up to them being a people. Their clothes, their food, their practices, and elevate themselves. Each culture should be proud for their heritage. And perhaps consider that imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, so that when other people borrow from, take from, share in, celebrating things from people in your ancestry, maybe use a different word that doesn't sound as blaming as cultural appropriation, or maybe understand that cultural appropriation is something so pervasive that it's okay, like people have been doing forever. It's food for thought. I look forward to hearing from you.